Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, are dragons actually worth having if they are the source of so much pain and suffering? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Fire and Blood. That's right. This is written by George R.R. Martin. It was illustrated by Doug Wheatley. I did the audiobook version of it, so I didn't see any of the illustrations, but Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire series illustrations are always high quality, top-notch, beautiful. It was published on November 20th, 2018 by Random House Worlds originally. It's gone through a number of different reprints, and the log line here of this novel is that it's set 300 years before A Game of Thrones, and it's wholly about the Targaryen dynasty, and part of this book has been adapted into the HBO series House of the Dragon. Okay, so the reason, well, let me just give you my initial thoughts. I felt like I was in college again, listening to lectures about history. And look, history, our regular world history can be incredibly fascinating and engaging and just wildly amazing. But it can also be boring as shit. It just really depends on how it's presented and how much detail and information actually exists compared to what you already know, and the sort of unraveling of knowledge that maybe isn't common when it comes to history. And so when you're reading Fire and Blood, you're really getting that sense of, well, they're speeding past a whole lot of stuff. They're jumping around in the timeline. Compared to where they are, they'll jump ahead, talk about something and someone else, and then they'll jump back. And it's just this constant back and forth and exhaustive explanation about the history of Westeros. And look, there was a World of Ice and Fire novel. It wasn't really a novel. It was more like a coffee table book that I had already read and reviewed, in addition to the Rise of the Dragon coffee table book, which I read and reviewed. And both of those sources have information from this specifically, but they're presented in slightly different ways, more, focused on art and this overarching story than the nit and gritty details. This is all about historical details. And so I just felt like I was in college the whole time, sitting through lectures. And it took me 3 times. Like when it was originally released, I tried to listen to the audiobook back and forth to work, which is how I listen to audiobooks, and I couldn't do it. It was just, I was losing track of who the hell they were talking about. And so years later, I tried again. I was like, you know what? I really love Game of Thrones. I should give this another shot. And I couldn't get through it again. And this third time I started last week, and I've just been burning through it. And the only reason why it made any logical sense to me is because I was looking at a lineage sheet, like a genealogy printout of all of the different kings, Targaryen kings, the entire Targaryen family tree. If I didn't have that to look at, I would never have understood what the hell they're talking about or who they're talking about. Because George R.R. Martin uses the same names in a multitude of variations for every single person. And it's so frustrating because you can't tell who the fuck he's talking about unless you look at a family tree. Because there's just so many similar names. And then the person that pronounces them, in the audiobook specifically, doesn't really pronounce them that differently than the previous variation or the children's variation. So you're just completely lost about what the hell is going on. I did get through it and I did understand it. So I'm here to say success. It can be done, but do yourself a favor and look at a family tree doing it. Okay. So, George R.R. Martin, before he even finished his Song of Ice and Fire series, there's supposed to be 2 more novels in the whole Game of Thrones series, A Song of Ice and Fire, that he has just abjectly refused to finish because he has been jumping on A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, The Tales of Dunk and Egg. He's been jumping on this, wanting to talk about the Targaryen history, and a whole multitude of other short stories and stuff that he's been focusing on rather than getting the original series out. But I can't say I disagree with this being put out there. However, his original plan was that this was going to be a 2-part volume. It's going to talk about the Targaryen dynasty from when Aegon the Conqueror came to Westeros originally, when they fled Old Valyria and came here. And then this one will be half of their lineage. And the second book, which is yet to be announced and yet to be presumably written, is going to talk about the second half of the dynasty, ending with the Game of Thrones era, probably with Daenerys when she retakes the Iron Throne, and however his A Song of Ice and Fire series ends, because he did mention that his ending is different than the HBO series A Game of Thrones ending, because of course they ran out of material, and so David Benioff and Weiss had to figure out, just make up this story as they went along, because there's no source material to go with. Which is also why everyone hated the final seasons of Game of Thrones series. But I didn't hate them so much. I mean, it's a version, Here's the other thing about this that you should know going in. Everything about this history is through unreliable narrators. All the information garnered. So it's presented as if from one maester sort of recounting the tales, but he's referencing, in a lot of cases, 3 different perspectives. One from a jester, one from a septum, and one from a maester. And so you never know which version is true or actually happened. So instead of saying, no, this is the actual history, he's saying, well, some people say this happened, some people say that happened, some people say that happened. Why can't you just go with one solid story? And I don't know if this is a reaction of the D.B. Weiss Game of Thrones series, where he's like, look, if they're not even going to do what I say anyway, and they're not going to wait on my stuff, then I'm just going to throw out a bunch of different possibilities, and then showrunners can kind of take whatever version they want and go with it, because they're clearly not listening to what I have to say. And that would be petulant and childish, but how can you kind of argue with that mentality when they did straight up just change his stuff? Which is frustrating for someone who creates something to have someone else mess with it, And I get it, but it doesn't mean it's not frustrating. All is that to say, this first volume of the 2-volume trilogy or duology about the Targaryen kings is called Fire and Blood, and it covers the history of Westeros from Aegon's conquest up to and through the regency of the boy king Aegon III. Now, Fire and Blood takes the form of a scholarly treatise about the Targaryen dynasty written by historian Archmaester Gildane. And the first section deals with Aegon's conquest, describing Aegon I's conquest of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, more or less the same version that was published in the World of Ice and Fire book that I've already reviewed. So they've made small little updates and changes and variations here and there. Not really important, because most of this early history stuff, because there's not 3 different perspectives, they just lay out a basic general history. Now, the strength of Aegon's conquest, for me, is actually where the Valyrians and Targaryens come from. It's Old Valyria. That's what's so interesting to me about it, because it talks about Old Valyria sort of falling away from the gods and being punished by the gods because they went into like blood sorcery, and they were like doing all sorts of crazy mystical rituals. And so the gods sort of punished them by having the volcanoes explode and destroying most of the land. But Old Valyria is still there. It's still cursed, and there's still people there. There's actually a story of one of the daughters flying on her dragon to Valyria. I think it was, well, I can't remember exactly right now. I mean, this is like almost 800 pages of history over hundreds of years. So, it's just under 200 or so years. So it becomes difficult to keep all the details fresh in your mind. But basically, she goes on Dragonback. The dragon takes her to Old Valyria. She comes back nearly dead, just clutching the dragon, and she has these living entities inside of her, similar to like Alien, right? And so they're like crawling on inside her. They end up cutting her open to get these things out. And they're like serpents with human faces on them. Some of them are serpents with hands. So she was clearly infected with something that was over in Valyria, but they never go back to find out what it was. They never have any exploration, or any exploration that's done they don't talk about because it never returns, or it's so horrific that they don't want to share the rumors or anything to draw other people there. Whatever the reality, it makes me want to know more about Old Valyria. What the state, like, I want to know the history of Old Valyria from founding to now, till the end of Game of Thrones. Like, that's what I want, because that would be so interesting to me. It's just so much more interesting than just Westerosi history. And Westerosi history in its prehistory is equally wildly entertaining. The first men came over, they were talking with these fairies and fae. They started sort of overrunning the fae, and so the fae got scared and had to create this creature to fight off the first men as a defense mechanism. They created the White Walkers doing that. I mean, it's this huge, long, storied sort of self-defeating act that they go through. But it's super interesting, and I love that stuff. As soon as we start getting into Aegon coming over, his conquest is interesting, and his formation of the Seven Kingdoms is even though it wasn't actually Seven Kingdoms when he did it, is interesting. But then you start getting into like, oh, his wife had a bunch of lovers, and he had a bunch of lovers, and ruling, and people got upset, and then it's just like, I don't give a fuck about this stuff. What are you doing? Why are you telling me these tiny little sordid details that have no bearing on the history at all? And they just go to, further this. This is like masturbation. This is like George R.R. Martin just masturbating. It's him enjoying his own creation for himself. And everyone else has to now watch him masturbate in front of them. That's what it feels like, where you're just like, fuck, you're clearly doing this for you and not me. Like, just finish, wash your hands, and let's move on with the damn story. Hey, Chris, this one explains the connection between Targaryens and the dragons. No. This one, it has a very brief little snippet of that. This is all about once the Targaryens come to Westeros and take it over. So this is about the early history of all of the Targaryen dynasty, ostensibly. So, the next part is about the reign of the dragon and the wars of King Aegon the First, and the three heads had the dragon and governance under King Aegon the First, following Aegon the First's reign and his conquest. And while his reign is briefly glossed over in the World of Ice and Fire that I've already reviewed, no parts of that chapter had been published before, so it was all new, but again, wasn't all great. And then we go to the Sons of the Dragons, which focuses on the lives of Aegon the First's sons, Aenys the First and Maegor the First, ending with Maegor's death and the ascension of Aenys' son Jaehaerys Targaryen to the throne. Now, an abridged novella of this same name was released previously in October 2017 in the anthology The Book of Swords, but it's presented here in its full form. And, this is when we're finally getting from father to son, and you see how long and arguably how short these successions last as people are getting on the Iron Throne and experiencing. And the Iron Throne itself is the melted down swords of all of the people that Aegon the First defeated in his conquest of Westeros. So that's kind of interesting. You're welcome, Chris. Then we go to the long reign of Jaehaerys the First, which is described over 7 chapters, and clearly Jaehaerys the First did a pretty damn good job. And then we go to the heirs of the dragon, because he reigned for so long, and he ended up dying of old age. So then we go to the heirs of the dragon, a question of succession, which focuses on the succession crisis following the deaths of Jaehaerys' sons and the eventual reign of his grandson, Viserys the First. And the novella The Rogue Prince, previously published in the anthology Rogues in 2014, uses the majority of this text, which was adapted in the first season of HBO's House of the Dragon. So this is where we get finally to the Dance of the Dragon. So this entire book is basically broken up into 2 sections. It's the conquering and governance of Westeros by the Targaryens, and the Dance of the Dragons, where it's Targaryen family sort of having this inner civil war with itself. So those are the two main parts of it. And what it does is tell you that the Targaryens are not gods. A lot of people sort of presented them as if they were gods in the Game of Thrones series. The more you learn about them, and while some of them think they're gods, the more you learn about them, they're just as fucked up as everyone else, and they're just normal people. They just happened to be able to commune with dragons and tame them and ride them. And they couldn't even really tame them that well, to be quite honest. But they bended them to their will enough that they could actually just ride them. So that, having it present this sort of flawed view of the Targaryens is interesting. And once it got to the Targaryen Dance of the Dragon sort of section here, that's when I started really having fun with this. Because, again, I watched the first two seasons of the series, and it gives you a sort of historical perspective through three different perspectives of that same story. And so some of it's different, and depending on the version that you're going to want to ascribe to, their motivations and outcomes are different, but it is interesting, that part of it, I think. So the early conquest is great. The Dance of the Dragons is great. After that, it starts to sort of just fall apart again, because again, it just comes to a point of family fighting family over who's going to be the next king. And that gets tiresome over and over and over again. And then you have normal people fighting to be king. And then, it's just like they come back and they retake their kingdom. And like, how many times are we going to have to go over this same exact thing over and over and over again? And it turns out a whole hell of a lot. So then the Dying of the Dragons is the next part. And that's split into 6 different chapters, and it focuses on the Dance of the Dragons, the successive war between Rhaenyra Targaryen and her younger half-brother Aegon II. And an abridged version of it was included in The Princess and the Queen, which was published in the anthology Dangerous Women in 2013. These chapters form the primary basis of House of the Dragon. And the Dying of the Dragons is brutal. And regardless of who you like in the House of the Dragon series, if you're watching that, it does not go the way you want it to. It is horrible. And I'm so upset that it ended the way it did. And that, we're still, even when this ends, we're at the fallout, because it ends with Aegon III, who is the son of Rhaenyra Targaryen. And so, yeah, he's on the throne, but the time it takes for him to get there, and all the shit that happens between, and all the people that suffer because of it, and the constant sort of turmoil and turning over of the Iron Throne to finally get him there is ridiculous. And there's no way that they're going to be showing all of this in the series, because they just don't. I think they said they're going to stop it after 5 seasons of the series, I think. I'm going off of memory, but I believe they said that. And there's no way they can include all of this in 5 seasons. So they have to end at a point where no one watching is going to be happy. First of all, no one will ever be happy, but there is a better conclusion the longer you take to get to the end. But there's so much that happens before you get to that end that there's just no way that people are going to get what they want out of it. It's doomed. Only because they have a cap on it. If they can tell the story in 5 seasons, then awesome. But you have to end with Aegon III, and that's not a happy ending. So, it's tumultuous at best. All right. So then the aftermath after the Dance of the Dragons concludes, the final section of this book is the Hour of the Wolf, and it describes the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons, this ascension of Rhaenyra's son Aegon III to the throne, while the book's 4th and final chapters cover the early period of Aegon III's reign, when the realm was ruled by his regents, and it ends with him finally shaking loose his regents, choosing his own hand, and being reunited with his brother who was thought lost. So that is as good of an ending as one can expect in Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. That's just the realities of this world. It's harsh, but I really don't think the amount of time it took to get there, the amount of time spent on all of the different families when this is supposed to be about the Targaryens, all the time it's spent about Essos when this is, and yes, Essos has a large role to play with Westeros and the Targaryens. It has historically, and it always will. And it was arguably half of the screen time in a Game of Thrones TV series. But it is infinitely less interesting every time you go to Essos than it is when you're remaining in Westeros dealing with what's happening there. And so because they spend so much time sort of bouncing around between families and stuff, you're not really getting a sense of connection with any characters because it's not a narrative. This is a recounting of history. And so because everything is from a 10,000 perspective view, you're not becoming invested in any one character, and you're just reading history as it's already happened. So it's not as if you're reading a novel as if it's unfolding. It's a completely different frame of mind, which means you are less invested in the outcome, and it is less surprising when these big events happen because you're just not invested in characters because of the way it's, trying to tell like 200 years of history in 800 pages, 730 pages or something. So, anyone dying of old age in this world has been a shock to the citizens. Yeah, for sure. Just curious, are you aware how the ratings and audience score compares between House of the Dragon and the Seven Kingdoms? House of the Dragons got very bad ratings from the audience. Not many people tuned into it. And Night of the Seven Kingdoms is by far the best rated of all the three series so far. And justifyingly so. There's a little bit of hope in it. And people need hope right now. The world is a mess right now. We need hope. So The Night of the Seven Kingdoms is a perfect show for that. A little sadness, but a little bit of hope as well. All right, so my favorite parts of this, again, Old Valyria, the conquering of the Seven Kingdoms, that was great. And I love hearing about the kings that ruled well. Now, arguably, they're not as interesting because there's not as much to say about it because they were good people. But they're so few and far between that it becomes frustrating. And then, of course, the destruction of all of the dragons and stuff has to be my least favorite. Look, I'm a fantasy nerd. I love dragons. I think they're awesome. And I love Westeros's versions of dragons. But to see them just completely, almost clearly wiped out by the end of this book. I mean, there's still a whole bunch of eggs out there that haven't hatched. There's still a handful of dragons out there. Some of them less powerful and stuff. But it's just not the same, I mean, this is clearly that tipping point of at the end of the next Targaryen book is, if he ever releases it, is going to be the dragons being fully gone. And arguably probably before the end of that, like the 2/3 through it, all the dragons will have been destroyed and gone. So until Rhaenyra, of course, comes back at the very, very end. Or that's not Rhaenyra. It's, oh my gosh, it's been so long. I can't remember her name. I can't remember now. Well, anyway, I'm talking about the Game of Thrones girl. So, until she comes back, the dragons have all been gone for a very, very long time. And so, the last dragons were like the size of dogs, and they basically couldn't fly and couldn't really breathe fire or anything. So I don't know, like I hate the extinction of the dragons, tied intimately with the extinction of the Targaryens, it seems. Because as the Targaryens are dying out and having more and more corrupt rulers, the dragons seem to be ebbing and disappearing, preceding that outcome. And so there's this weird sort of literal symbiotic relationship between the two that is both sad and frustrating for readers, especially people like me who really, really love dragons and want to experience them more. So I think that's my least favorite, aside from the general history book feel of this entire novel. And that's kind of it. now that I'm looking through my notes here, I don't have anything else. I mean, we went from Aegon the Conqueror to King Aenys the First, his son, to Maegor the Cruel, his son, to King Jaehaerys the First, Aenys' son, to King Viserys the First, Jaehaerys' grandson, to King Aegon the Second, Prince Viserys' son, to King Aegon the Third, the Broken King, who was actually Rhaenyra's son, and he married Alicent's and her father Viserys' daughter, or granddaughter, in order to unify the two houses at the end. But again, she's not long for the world. So the Targaryen women, they get the short end of the stick. Arguably women in this world get the short end of the stick almost every time. But that's one of the reasons why I like this world, is that it showcases women as this is what it would be like in a sort of medieval-minded time. But there's always exceptions of women that stand out as incredibly powerful, incredibly manipulative, or incredibly, their ability to withstand and rise above the machinations of the others, people around them. And so it's easy to say, well, all the women have a hard shake here, but the women that do stand out are incredibly strong and incredibly powerful. So he does write women in a very, what my perception is, a real way. I was raised by very strong women. I've known very strong women my entire life, and I've known more weak men than weak women. So it speaks to my experience seeing so many strong women out there in his writing. But they are just as mortal as men, so they're just as evil or wicked or duplicitous or, beneficent or, it's not like he's saying one sex is better than the other or anything. It's just like, no, these are all creatures of the human condition, and this is all how they behave based on these circumstances around them. So anyway, I dug that. Ultimately, I had to give this 3 out of 5 Evil Eyes. I love A Song of Ice and Fire world that he's built and put together. I love the history, as long as I don't have to sit through lectures. And this was hours and hours and hours of lectures. And not fun for me. It was very much just George R.R. Martin beating off. And I can do without that. So that's all I have for this review. Thank you guys so much for tuning into it. If you appreciate what I'm putting together, consider becoming a patron or a member on YouTube. Links are in the description below. As always, remember the evil spelled backwards is live. So get out there and be evil.